Hey, this is Coach Anderson from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. What we're going to do today is pick up with Unit 13, Lesson number 3, Presidential Transition, the Ford and Carter years. Now, one of the things that we want to make sure that we start with is that Nixon resigns the presidency, of course, in 1974. And now the appointed president, appointed vice president, then appointed president of the United States of America, is Gerald R. Ford. Now, in looking at Ford, we're going to find that there's going to be a little bit of transition when you go from the Nixon administration to the Carter administration, and we're going to talk about that transition briefly today. What we'll do, of course, is start with the unit focus question, of which we have 3 that we will address as soon as we finish with the unit. What effect did the Nixon presidency have on American public psyche? 2, why did conservatism become such an attractive political philosophy in the United States? And 3, describe the effect of technology and scientific innovation on the increased globalization of the United States. We'll start, of course, also with the vocabulary and do as we always tell you to do. Take out your journals, write down these particular terms, define them yourselves, and as we see them, as they come up in the lesson, we'll try to address as many of them as we can. All right, we'll start with one lesson focus question, which we will answer at the end of the lesson. What economic problem ultimately caused both Carter and Ford not to be reelected President of the United States of America? And I can tell you it's a one-word answer, and right now in 2025 is one of those issues that is plaguing America right now. Journal topic. Take out your journals, write down this particular, read this particular statement. It says, our commitment to human rights must be absolute. The powerful must not persecute the weak, and humanity must be enhanced. We pledge perseverance and wisdom in our efforts to limit the world's armaments to those necessary for each own nation's domestic safety. What do you think Jimmy Carter meant with this statement when it was made during his inaugural address on January 20th, 1977? So, read that question, that statement again from his inaugural address, and tell us what you think. All right, when you look at it, it says the powerful must not persecute the weak and humanity must be enhanced. Jimmy Carter is a wonderful man from Plains, Georgia, that probably was before his time, and probably as President of the United States of America was probably a softer touch than we probably needed at that particular time. But he believed in human rights. And he was a president kind of like Woodrow Wilson, that he believed that morality is something that, of course, that should take place when it comes to nations in their treatment of other nations around the world. So he's advocating human rights here. And he said that basically he wants to limit, nuclear weapons. He wants to have a world in which, weapons and weapons, deployment and production is not something that we should be striving to do. We should be striving to make humanity better. So when you look at that particular statement, it gives you an insight into the man's from Plains, Georgia. All right, the 1970s economic crisis. Now, both Carter and Ford will be plagued with the same issue, and that biggest issue is going to be inflation. And we'll talk about it in different forms, but at the end of the day, prices is what cost both of them the elections, the elections of 1976 and the election of 1980, respectively. The economic crisis of the 1970s started with the deficit spending caused by Vietnam and the Great Society, during which LBJ refused to raise taxes and clung to the gold standard. In the early 1970s, OPEC nations used America's oil dependence as a political tool by raising the price of oil. Gas prices started to rise, and inflation started to inflate consumer goods. So not only were we hurting at the pump, that sound familiar, but we also were hurting, of course, in the grocery store. Nixon converted American currency to the fiat currency, which stated that the dollar has value because the government says it does. The fiat currency, which allowed the Federal Reserve to manipulate the money supply to control inflation, and Nixon's shock policy did have some initial success. So before Nixon, we had started, our currency, of course, was based on the gold standard. What Nixon proposes to do is put us on fiat currency, which means that basically you can't go to the store, or you can't go to the bank and the store. You can't go to the bank and cash, paper dollars, of course, in for gold, gold value. So fiat currency simply says that the money that you have or the paper money you have has value because the federal government says it has value. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't think anybody should know how they feel about it. I would think that if they say, if I got $100 in gold, $100 bills, and if it's worth $100 in gold, I think I would really want to have that $100 in gold. What we're going to show you there, this is a picture of the OPEC nations, that the ones that are in the 1970s and 1980s, of course, that controlled the oil supply basically, and nations like the United States of America that was dependent on it would have to get it from these countries like Venezuela, Ecuador, Libya, Algeria, Nigeria, some of these places, of course, in Africa, over India, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, Iraq, some of these nations at some point, will become members of OPEC, even nations, of course, in Indonesia. So we're going to be looking at the United States of America is going to be a little bit at their mercy when it comes to oil production and therefore gas prices. Now, in terms of looking at today's standards now, you have to understand, gas at that particular time, if it went up to 60 cents a gallon or 70 cents a gallon, today we would love that, right? But it was a different time. All right, Ford and Carter attempt to end inflation. And this is the one thing, of course, that caused them both to be defeated in the elections of 76 and 80, respectively. Ford's Whip Inflation Now, or WIN program, and Carter's reduction of the government spending and cutting taxes were effective in ending the stagflation of the 1970s. But it doesn't do enough. Consumer goods prices continued to rise, and lines at American gas pumps got longer and longer. And Coach Anderson is old enough to know and was around when you saw these lines on television every day. Gas lines, gas prices went from an average of 36 cents a gallon in 1972 to $1.19 per gallon in 1980. Ford and Carter's foreign policy. Ford continued détente, but his greatest failure happened when 41 American Marines were killed trying to rescue the crew of the Megas, who were already freed and safe from the Cambodian control. This ship, the Megas, was captured by the Cambodians. They were released, the hostages were released, and before Ford could withdraw American troops to try to liberate that ship, 41 of them were killed. So in essence, 41 Americans died for no reason, because what the mission that they were supposed to be on shouldn't have been a mission anymore because they had already been freed. He did negotiate the Helsinki Accords that eased tensions between NATO countries, of course, and Warsaw Pact nations by agreeing on borders of Eastern Europe. Carter's foreign policy was based on around the securing of human rights around the world, ending détente, and Carter's failure was to take over Iran by the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the subsequent hostage crisis where American hostages were taken by Iran for 444 days. You have to understand the United States of America had supported the Shah of Iran. He was one of those leaders that didn't treat his people very well, but the United States of America supported him because he was a bulwark against communism, of course, in the Middle East. And what we did want, of course, is that the communist Russians or the communist Soviets, of course, to gain influence in the region, because then they could further impact the oil supply in that particular region. Carter did have success with the Camp David Accords, which was an agreement between Israel and their Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, who was the leader of Egypt. And what they did is they created this, and what it did for 35 years, there would be no violence between Egypt and Israel. Carter did create a treaty to return the Panama Canal back to Panama in 1999. And the Panama Canal, in his mind, was one of the last vestiges of imperialism that the United States of America could gain some goodwill by turning the Panama Canal back over to the Panamanians, and they received it December 31st, 1999. And if you remember, in today's politics here in 2024, 25, we're going to find that there's going to be a push, of course, to have the Panama Canal returned to American control. Don't think it'll happen, but who knows? Anything's possible. Now, one of the things that happened during the Carter administration that doesn't get talked about quite a lot was the 1980 Olympic boycott. And when you look at all those nations around the world, Canada, the United States of America, and then several nations down here, of course, in in South America, and then nations throughout Africa, the Middle East, of course, and Asia. We're going to find that these nations don't participate in the 1980 Olympics because the United States of America boycotts, and some of our allies boycott involvement because the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Once again, Carter was all about human rights and making sure that the weak are not, subjected to the whims, of course, of the powerful. So because of that, in protest of the Soviet Union taking over and invading Afghanistan, something that they didn't want any part of, they found out after a little while. We're going to find that, the 1980 Olympics, of course, will be boycotted, and it's for the first time politics will bleed over into sports. And in 1984, guess what? The Soviets decide that they won't, and the Eastern Bloc countries, they won't come to the United States of America, the Olympics in the United States of America. Here you have the Camp David Accords. On the left, you have Anwar Sadat, and on the right, you have Menachem Begin and then Jimmy Carter, and they're signing the treaty, the peace treaty between these two countries that'll last for 35 years. Here you have Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was the Shah of Iran, that ruled Iran as a pro-Western monopoly from 1941 to 79, supported by the United States of America because he was a bulwark against communism. And here you have the Ayatollah Khomeini, who replaces the Shah of Iran, takes American hostages and holds them for 444 days. And to kind of give you an idea about Carter, we told you he's a little bit of a soft touch. He probably would have been, better at being president maybe a little bit later. On the day that Carter leaves office and Ronald Reagan is inaugurated, January 20th, 1981, Iran and the Ayatollah released the 444 hostages, something that Carter couldn't manage during his time as President of the United States. What we're going to do is do a quick worksheet, and on this particular worksheet, what we want you to do is to get a copy of it right quick, go through, we'll give you a few minutes, of course, to answer the questions, and then we'll come back and give you some insights on the other side. At this time, take a few minutes, get this copied, and we'll give you some time to complete it, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss. All right, you should have had enough time that you were able to go through and copy that. Now what we want you to do is take a few minutes, go through and complete the activity, and then we'll come back on the other side and we'll look at your answers. All right, you should have had enough time that you were able to go through and look at that worksheet. And what we'll do is look at a few of these, especially the true and false. They're pretty easy to do. But what was the primary economic problem facing America in the 1970s? People faced rising costs, inflation, stagnant wages, job insecurity, all of which created a sense of economic distress and uncertainty. It's something that we would eventually call stagflation. Why was the Federal Reserve role crucial in the 1970s? Because what it could do, the government could do, is they could use the Federal Reserve to manipulate the money supply to try to control inflation. Look at the true and false questions. The U.S. economy in the 1970s was characterized by low inflation and high economic growth. That would be false. It was high inflation and low economic growth. 2, President Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates by removing the dollar's convertibility to gold. That is true. He went to fiat currency, if you remember. In 1979, the oil crisis was caused by the collapse of OPEC and the increase of global oil production. False, because OPEC was created, and what they did, of course, is they reduced global oil production and that affected the United States of America. 4, President Ford's Whip Inflation Now program was largely successful in curbing inflation. That is false. Remember, we said the thing that kills both the Carter and the Ford administrations is going to be inflation. 5, deregulation of industries like airlines and trucking occurred under President Carter's administration, and that would be true. So what we're able to do, of course, is to give you some insights in terms of what were some of those things that Ford and Carter, of course, were able to to try to address to get the country, of course, back on sound economic ground. But we're going to find it's going to be a struggle. And because we talked about it as such great length, this particular question, once again, can be answered in one word. It says, what economic problem ultimately caused both Carter and Ford not to be reelected President of the United States of America? And I'm sure I gave you a long, drawn-out excuse, but at the end of the day, they were both unable to get inflation under control. Oil prices didn't hurt, hurt their cause also, but at the end of the day, it was inflation. Well, this is Coach Anderson of Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, and remember, we always tell you that you shouldn't take my word for it. Do your own research, draw your own conclusions, and with that, we'll see you next time.